Hey, Randy Joe here, and this is 1001 Reviews, the series where I plan on reviewing every single album from the 1001 Albums to Listen to Before You Die book. And today we are looking at The Byrds' 1966 album, Fifth Dimension. Fifth Dimension, released in 1966 underneath the Columbia label, produced by Jim Dixon with Alan Stanton. Art direction uncredited, nationality USA, in a running time of 29 minutes and 25 seconds. The thing about Fifth Dimension by the Byrds is that most of what you hear on this record is really only early ideas of things that would later flourish and come to the surface in the music industry over the next 10 or so years, which in a way is definitely the greatest strength of this record, as it is quite predictive of many things to come, despite the fact that I feel as if this record doesn't necessarily flesh them out or have them that polished. There are very early ideas being set in stone throughout this thing, and that really is its greatest key strength. And this record released shortly after the departure of Gene Clark, who wrote most of the Byrds' early music along with Bob Dylan songs. And with him leaving, the rest of the band had to take the helm of the writing aspects of the music here, and I think they managed to pull that off even without Gene Clark there, as most of the lyrical content and most of the writing here is definitely still very quite intelligent and worth a listen. I mean, right off the bat, you have the song Fifth Dimension, the title track, that is a very philosophical, heavy track about achieving enlightenment and almost ascending beyond our current dimension into this fifth dimension, going beyond time and space itself and being a much more profound and celestial-like being, one might argue. This is especially obvious with lyrics like, "All my two-dimensional boundaries were gone, I had lost them too badly. I saw the world crumble and thought I was dead, but I found my senses still working," which obviously this is kind of showing these boundaries being broken by the narrator here as he continues to ascend beyond the current form that he is, going deeper into a fifth dimension, like he says. And through this deep philosophical track, it also manages to splice in very early psychedelic tones that haven't quite taken off in the mainstream music yet. And speaking of things that haven't taken off in the mainstream that the Byrds were doing here on this record, you also have the third track, Mr. Spaceman, which is sort of like a space folk psychedelic rock song that is very much a precursor to much of what the psychedelic space age rock music would come in the 70s. For example, this could be argued to be like a precursor to much of what David Bowie's putting out with something like Hunky Dory's Life on Mars, or even Rocket Man by Elton John, as these very space-heavy songs and space-heavy genres that would bloom and flourish in the early 70s had some level of influence come from Mr. Spaceman, as this was the first of its kind, especially in a time in the late 60s where the space age and the space race was such a heavy topic. The Byrds were really tackling that before anyone else really got to it yet. The fifth track, What's Happening, is by far my favorite one on this album, as it has this really gentle skittering drum beat with these vocals that are mixed quite well into the track and sound much more clear than anything else on this album, really, with overall this song production-wise feeling much more dynamic and spread about rather than too focused in on one zone. It is a Crosby written track, one of the few ones on here, and the very first Crosby written track period, with these carrying influence of raga rock, meaning that it has a lot of Indian-like tones and Indian-like classical music spliced into the sound here, especially with its droning guitars, which is very much Indian-based. And speaking of genre hopping, this raga rock style returns later in the song 8 Miles High, which is not only a raga rock track, but also carries influences of psychedelic rock and psychedelic pop, mixing in very early psychedelic sounds that haven't quite taken off yet in the mainstream, but here is being infused with other genres long before it even took off itself. In fact, this is such an early psychedelic rock track that many critics and people would argue that this is the very first of psychedelic rock. This is the base, this is the beginning, this is just the start of a huge genre that would really take off in the future. And even though I don't necessarily think this is obviously the best form of psychedelic rock, the style is definitely put forward here and kind of put on display. But even though most of this album carries a lot of different styles and tones and isn't all that polished with it, there are some songs that are pretty flat and one note in my opinion that don't carry the same sense of influential weight as the rest of the tracks here. Hey Joe, Where You Gonna Go is a track on here actually that the rest of the band didn't even really want to include in the track list, except Crosby pushed for this song. And I can see why the rest of the band didn't want it, as it is a very one note and flat track having a very folk centered style that doesn't really carry a lot of weight in my opinion. Same could be said about the song John Riley. While even though I like the topic here, sort of delving into the end of the book, The Odyssey by Homer, that really is all the song has going for it, as instrumentally and structurally this isn't that interesting of a track and really does again feel quite one note and kind of deaf to the rest of the album. It is one of the 2 strings songs on here, which I guess speaks for something, but even still, if the strings aren't that engaging, then why even bother? And then the last song here, 242 Foxtrot, is the very first instance of the Byrds using a sound effect in their music, as there is this taking off jet sound effect along with pilots communicating over intercoms that parallel next to this very repetitive nature of the track, with the vocals repeating the exact same things over and over again, along with the instrumental also being a repeating like beat to create a overall hypnotic like track. Again, something that speaks to a psychedelic sort of style. So overall, I would say this album does manage to spread itself out quite a bit, but one might argue spread itself too thin, as a lot of these styles and sounds here, even though they are precursors, are not that well polished and not fully fleshed out, but definitely still quite important to the grand scheme of things with how influential they would come to be. So with that being said, the soft rating of this album came to a 7.2 out of 10, but I will round that down to a hard rating of 7 out of 10. And even still, despite the fact that it's only getting a 7 out of 10, I do think the influences here and the things that would go on to be so impactful to the music industry for the next decade or so are definitely worthy of the attention for what the Byrds were doing. So this gets a E for essential. It is worth a listen. At only 29 minutes, it is definitely worth it, as you get a lot of different influences here coming through quite strongly. Anyways, let's go ahead and see what the next album we are going to listen to in the book is. Random number generator 1 to 1001, generate 698, which will be the album Pearl Jam's 1991 album 10. So give Pearl Jam's 10 a listen, and I'll review that in exactly 1 week from now. Anyways, that pretty much is it for this video. If you like the video, please hit like and subscribe if you want to follow along and listen to every album from the 1001 Albums Listened to Before You Die book. As always, my name is Randy Joe, and I'm signing off.